Bruce by Bob Leiter. Narrated by James R. Cheatham. The Sandcastle romances are available on Amazon in ebook format for pre-order. Clark Farnsworth sat on the edge of the bed, stretched out his long, naked body, and snatched up the phone. He dialed the Hempstead apartment super. "Yeah? What is it?" "He's barking again, Harry. I can't sleep. Do something about it, or I'll break in and kill the damn dog." Clark imagined Harry sitting on his ass in his basement domain, sucking on a beer. "I'll talk to her again, Mr. Farnsworth. Having the dog is included in her lease. It's so little I didn't think it would be a problem." "Her curves and those big blues have anything to do with it, Harry? I've seen the way you look at her." "Maybe you look at her the same way, Mr. Farnsworth. I hope you can get some sleep. I'll talk to her." "You do that. In the meantime, I'm making a recording of that dog's yapping. You'd think it would get tired eventually and shut up." Clark hung up the phone and placed the recorder on a chair near the wall between his apartment and the yapping dog. He tapped on the wall. The dog resumed barking. He sat in front of the computer in the living room. He typed, "The trouble with you, Hobart, is you don't have the balls." "You know that's not true, Virginia. You've had your eager little hands on them often enough." Clark sat back, pressed his hands over his ears, got up, and went to the kitchen. He warmed leftover coffee. Back in his chair, he listened to the dog yap and stared at the screen. As was often his custom when he wasn't sure about dialogue he had written, he read it aloud. Was the bit about Hobart not having any balls too strong? Was it something Virginia would say? What about the name Hobart? Was it suitable for the character? Clark stood, paced around the room, grabbed the coffee cup, and took it to the kitchen. He returned to the bed, squashed a pillow around his head, and tried to block out the barking. He did sleep. Not much, and surely not enough. He got up, pushed his legs into his jeans he picked up from the edge of the bed, and stretched. The radio clock on the nightstand read 7 a.m. "You can't sleep, so sit your ass down and write," he said aloud. He had to finish his Cynthia Castle romance or stop eating. He stared at the screen and listened to his stomach growl. He stood, walked to the kitchen, looked in the refrigerator, smelled something terrible, found some green applesauce, threw it out, and finished dressing. He turned on his cassette player and filled the apartment with the sounds of a trio playing the old standards. After listening for a minute, he left the apartment and paced in front of the elevator door, waiting for it to come up from the lobby. Clark frowned at the woman who came out of the elevator and watched her hips sway as she went to the apartment next to his and unlocked the door. A dog about the size of a weasel bounced around under the woman's feet. Clark was treated to a display of bare thighs as she leaned over and picked up the dog. She turned away from him and started to enter the apartment. Miss, may I speak to you for a moment?" "What is it?" "It's about your dog. It barks all day. It keeps me awake." She hitched the wiggling dog up against her chest and said, "You sleep all day?" "I work nights." "Oh, what do you do?" "It doesn't matter what I do. That damned dog interferes with my sleep." "Hear that, Poops? You've got to stop barking." She started to enter the apartment again. "I made a recording. Want to hear what Poops sounds like while I'm trying to sleep?" Clark motioned toward his open door. "No, thanks. If you have any complaints, file them with the super." "I already have," Clark said. "I'll get the tape, and you can listen to it in your apartment." He entered his apartment, returned with the recording, and was pleased to see she was still waiting. "What's that music you're playing? Rather loud, I might add. Clark held the tape out toward her and drew it back as Poops snapped at his fingers. The music? BG Adair Trio. Why? It's a nice sound. I like those oldies. She held Poops to the side, reached out and took the tape. He left the building, walked the block and a half to Carson's Cafe, and ate eggs, toast, and apple pie a la mode. He finished and drummed his fingers on the table. She seemed reasonable, he thought as he imagined the young woman listening to the tape. That was fast, the waitress Emmy said as Clark motioned for the bill. Yeah, I guess. Gotta get back. He left his usual tip and hurried back to Hempstead Arms. He hesitated after getting off the elevator and knocked on the door. She opened it without releasing the chain, peeked out and said, Oh, it's you. She slammed the door, came back in an instant, opened the door, and threw the tape out the small opening. She slammed the door again. Clark picked up the tape and felt blood rush to his face. Damn her. He rapped on the door again and again. The elevator door groaned open, and Miss Morgenthau, floppy hat and all, stepped out. She headed for her apartment down the hall. Clark rapped on the door again. Miss Morgenthau turned, put a gloved hand to her face and said, I've been meaning to talk to you about that music. You play it too loud sometimes. And too late. Oh, he said. Sorry about that. I'll watch it. Clark reached to pound on the apartment door again just as it opened. Yes, he does, Miss Morgenthau. I agree, the young woman in the doorway said. Poops raced between the woman's legs and wagged its tail so hard its rump swung back and forth. Clark scooped up the dog and handed it to the woman. Okay, you're right about the music. I'll watch it. Why did you throw the tape at me? It's obscene. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Obscene? Clark pointed the tape at her and said, What's obscene is the way that weasel barks. It doesn't even sound like a real dog. Good night, Martha. You and I will have to talk to the super about this, said Miss Morgenthau. Miss Morgenthau entered her apartment and closed the door with a bang. So, Martha was the dog owner's name. There must be a civilized way to resolve this, Clark thought. Martha closed her apartment door quietly. Clark entered his apartment and turned the music down. He sat at his computer and listened to a slow rendition of Love Me Forever. It was no good at first. He kept thinking of Martha. Martie, he would call her. He realized the dog wasn't barking. He typed out a fictionalized version of what had just happened in the hallway. He soon was turning out pages of a new Cynthia Castle romance. He liked it. Had conflict, emotion. He'd have to expand the plot. An attractive protagonist. Yes, Martie was a beauty. Nice shape, gorgeous hair. And those eyes. He wrote for 3 hours solid. And then he hit the sack, for once able to sleep during the day. Now his schedule was really screwed up. And what a name for a dog. He had a dog once. Named it Bruce after a favorite cartoon character. He put the tape in the player to get to the end of yesterday's recording so he could resume recording the barking. He was in the kitchen looking for something to eat when he heard his voice saying something about one of his fictional characters having her hands around a man's balls. He'd adjusted the tape and heard himself reading dialogue from his earlier writing. No wonder Martie was pissed. He leaned against the outside of his apartment door for 15 minutes before she came out. On your way to work? He asked. Breakfast. Don't have to be at work until 9. May I join you? No. I want to apologize for what was on that tape. She headed for the elevator. You should, she said over her shoulder. I will. At breakfast. She turned. You can apologize now. Although I can't imagine how you could justify what you said on that tape. The elevator arrived. She got in and tried to get out when he entered. The door closed. She did not try to stop it. "I'm a writer," Clark said. "Of course you are," Martie said as she backed into a corner. She hurried out as he stood away from the opened elevator door on the first floor. Clark lengthened his stride to keep up. A block later, she ducked into Carson's cafe and sat in a booth near the front. "Hi, Clark," Emmy, the waitress, said as Clark sat across from Martie. "Emmy, this is Martie," Clark said. "I know," the waitress said. "What will it be this morning?" "Orange juice, coffee, and the usual bagel," Martie said. "You eat here regularly?" Martie asked. "I never noticed you before." "Don't usually get here this early," Clark said. "So, you claim to be a writer?" "That's what I claim. I write romances," Clark said. "Come on. A rugged guy like you writes romances?" "Yeah, I write a western now and then. I tried mysteries but was no good at that. There's a demand for romances, so I write them." Emmy placed a tray in the empty booth next to them and set Mattie's breakfast in front of her. She put eggs, toast, and apple pie a la mode in front of Clark. Martie gazed at the pie and ice cream. Clark waited for her to say something. She shook her head, drank orange juice, and watched Clark gobble eggs and toast. He took a deep breath and started on the pie and ice cream. "You must be in a hurry," Martie said. "Not really, just habit. When I worked at the Gazette, I had half an hour for lunch. Been eating too fast ever since." "Now you sleep all day and write romances at night," Martie said. "Yeah, it's crazy, I guess. I was still working at the paper during the day when I started writing fiction at night. Now it seems it's the only time I can write." Martie wiped her mouth with a paper napkin, placed it on her plate, and stood. "You notice the dog doesn't bark when you're home?" Clark asked. "Yes. I wonder if that recording of yours is faked somehow. However, it does sound like Poops." "The dog is lonely, maybe scared, when you're gone. That's why it barks." "How would you know that?" "Just read it somewhere, I guess." "Maybe you should sit with it while I'm gone. Then it wouldn't bark, and you could write your romances." "Oh no, I'm not babysitting your dog." Martie turned to go. Clark pictured himself talking to Martie every morning as she left the dog with him. "Wait a minute," he said. "I guess I could try it for a day or so. I've got to get some writing done." "You won't be mean to Poops, will you?" The next morning, as he was about to go to bed, a knock on the door stopped him. He threw a bathrobe over his shoulders and opened the door. Martie stood there with Poops in her arms. Clark stared. "You said you wanted to keep Poops in the daytime so she wouldn't be lonely and stop barking." "I did say that, didn't I? Okay. Could you give me the dog?" As he reached out for it, his bathrobe threatened to open. He held it closed with one hand and held the dog in the other. She said, "Don't bite him now, Poops," and was gone. Clark stood by the door holding the wiggling dog. He sat it down and watched as it explored the apartment. Dogs leave doo-doo behind. Oh well, he'd worried about that later. He'd been pounding on the computer keys all night and was tired. He threw the bathrobe on a chair beside the bed and crawled in. He was almost asleep when the dog bounced from the floor onto the bed and next to him. He looked into begging dark eyes the size of little marbles as the dog bounded up and down. He reached over, caught the dog on the upswing, put it at the foot of the bed, and went to sleep. Several hours later, he was up making coffee. A knock on his door made him realize he was anticipating seeing Martie when she came to pick up her dog. He smiled as he opened the door. "Had the best night's sleep I've had in weeks," Clark said, predicting her question. "Poops didn't keep you awake then. What did she do all day?" For one thing, she peed on my kitchen floor. Guess I'll have to take her for a walk in the morning. Well, I guess this might work out then. Seems so. I've got a date this Saturday night. Maybe you could take care of her then? Maybe, Clark said. Martie stooped, picked up Poops, and said, Well, thanks. I'll let you get to work. I'd like to read one of your books. I looked for them in the library during my lunch hour. My pen name is Cynthia Castle. They wouldn't be under my real name. How did you know my name anyway? Ms. Morgenthau must have mentioned it. Cynthia Castle? Really? Are you telling me Cynthia Castle is a man? You are Cynthia Castle? The Cynthia Castle? Yeah, that's me. Are you one of my readers? That stuff is too lurid for me. Life is lurid, Clark said. Poops, he said when he was alone with the dog the following day. That's no name for a dog. Let's take off that silly pink ribbon around your neck. Here's something for you. Clark stooped and fastened a miniature, spiked, studded collar around Poops' neck. The fake spikes glistened. Clark said, There! Now you look like a dog. And I'm going to call you Bruce. Maybe the collar and the name will show the other dogs in the park you're nobody to fool with. Bruce stopped at an evergreen tree along the way, sniffed, and left her mark. In the park, she pooped and ran around and around, apparently chasing an unseen rabbit. A woman with a police dog on a chain appeared. The dog strained to get at Bruce. Clark picked the little dog up and carried it to his apartment. He dumped a can of dog food Martie had left into a bowl, put fresh water in another bowl, and sat down. Eventually, he fixed himself a couple of eggs and toast. By the time he finished eating, the dog was asleep on the kitchen floor. He tiptoed into the bedroom, shed his clothes, and slept until a knock roused him. Martie stood outside. Come in, Clark said. Bruce! The dog raced to the door, its claws sliding on the floor. Martie picked it up and said, Bruce? That's her name now. The collar lets the dogs of the park know she's nobody to fool with. You took her to the park? I was always afraid one of those big dogs would hurt her. And what's that thing around her neck? It's not as heavy as it looks. If you were another dog, would you fool with one named Bruce who wears a collar like that? Martie laughed, a musical sound that tingled in the air long after she left. I've read Return of Love and started Lost Love. Enjoyed the humor, but not so keen about those lurid love scenes. Well, that's what sells books. Human males and females do that stuff, you know. So I've heard, Martie said. She cuddled the dog in her arms, stepped out in the hall and said, Bruce! The dog wagged its tail. It's a lonely old town, Clark said Saturday night as he and Bruce sat on the living room couch. Clark read, and Bruce pushed her nose against his leg. How was the date? Clark asked when Martie returned at 10 p.m., carrying a pale blue paper sack. Nothing special, Martie said as she sat on the couch and scratched behind one of the dog's ears. Clark scratched the other ear as the dog sprawled between them. Martie fished a pink leash out of the sack. Bruce sniffed, raised her nose, and jumped off the couch. She doesn't like it. Doesn't fit her image as a fierce fighting dog, Clark said. How do you know all those details you put in your novels? Just imagination. That's what fiction writing is, using your imagination. Are you sure that couch love scene you seem to write into every novel isn't more than imagination? It does seem real by now, Clark said, as his arm glided around Martie's shoulder. Is this the part where the girl turns and bats her big blues at the hero's face? Right. Then the guy takes the girl's face in his hands and kisses her on the lips. They held their positions until Martie moved her face out of Clark's hands and maneuvered her neck. I don't remember writing that into one of those scenes, Clark said. Martie rubbed her neck, picked up Clark's hands, and placed them on her face. She noticed that Clark's eyes, only inches from hers, were dreamy green, or were they blue-green? "If you don't kiss me, my neck will get stiff again." Clark kissed her warm, moist lips. They moved against his. His tongue explored. Mattie's shoes thudded onto the floor. Bruce jumped down and sat looking up at Mattie and Clark. The dog jumped out of the way when they tumbled to the floor. They began clawing at each other's clothes. Bruce strolled to the corner of the room, curled up, and went to sleep. This has been Bruce by Bob Leiter, narrated by James R. Cheatham. If you enjoyed this little short story written by Bob, then I encourage you to head over to Amazon as well as Audible to check out the Nick Bancroft Mystery Series, which were also written by Bob Leiter. For more information on the entire series, to include Love and Other Sports by Bob Leiter, then head over to bancroftmysteries.com.